Welcome, everyone. Good. All right. So state, federal, and auto industry leaders have set ambitious targets to transition to electric vehicles over the coming decade. To support this transition, we will need millions of EV chargers. UC Berkeley's Energy and Resources Group, School of Information, and School of Law are developing a platform to meet this need. Today's talk is co-sponsored with the UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment, or CLE. And here to introduce today's speaker is Mr. Ken Alex, who's the Director of Project Climate for CLE. And prior to serving as the Director of Project Climate, Mr. Alex served as a Senior Policy Advisor to Governor Jerry Brown, as well as the Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and Chair of the Strategic Growth Council. Him and his office hosted a number of UCCS interns in the past, so we are so grateful. And so a warm welcome to Mr. Ken Alex and our esteemed panelists.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much to UC at Sacramento Center, your beautiful new center. It's great to see you. It's very funny to get to be introduced to introduce somebody, but I will be brief. I do want to introduce you to the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, or CLE, as was said. It's a research center at UC Berkeley at the law school, focusing on moving solutions more quickly to policy and to scale, with a particular focus on implementation. So really active use of research, and you'll hear quite a bit about that today. CLE is the home of the Wheeler Water Institute, which focuses on water issues in the state of California, and also on the California China Climate Institute, which is headed by former Governor Jerry Brown, obviously an international entity, and it is the sponsor of California's formal agreements with a series of Chinese provinces. Also, the home of Grizzly Corps, which is an AmeriCorps program that sends recent grads to farm and forest communities to work on climate-related issues. And we're also working with the state of California on something called the Subnational Methane Action Coalition, or SMAC, trying to take faster action around methane, just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that we're doing at CLE. Among them are a series of collaborations, one of which we'll talk about today, which is focused on with the Energy Resources Group at University of California at Berkeley, and two of really some of the best students around. And so let me introduce our three speakers today. Ankita Shambhag just she'll officially complete her master's in 3 days. Congratulations. And has a background in sustainable building and coding, working on several innovative projects, including sustainability consulting and multi-platform application development, and you'll see some of the fruits of that labor in a minute. Also today, Ari Bal Barak is in his first year as PhD student at Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley, advised by Dan Kamen, whom many of you may know. He studies data and computational tools to inform effective decarbonization policy, with an interest in incorporating key complexities such as justice and equity. And Aria also serves as an economist with the World Bank. And then my colleague, Mr. Ted Lamb, is a lawyer and the senior research fellow in the climate program at CLE, and he's now also the associate director at CLE, focusing on the development of state and local climate policies, transportation and building electrification. His undergraduate degree is from Brown, and his JD is from NYU. And with that, Ted, I hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you for joining us online. As Ken said, my name is Ted Lamb. I'm the Associate Director at CLE and the lead on our EV Equity Initiative. That initiative, broadly speaking, is the basis for today's presentation. We're going to focus on two core elements of our initiative, but I'll just briefly present the big picture of our work. A lot of the presentation that I'm making is about an initiative that is really moving forward, less about research that we've done in the past, more about what we're looking toward and how we want to work throughout the state and throughout the country to develop this area of policy, and a little bit of background on why we think it's so important. So our EV Equity Initiative, it's a multi-year initiative housed at the law school. And our goal is to build locally tailored and replicable approaches to the equity-focused development of electric vehicle and electrified mobility infrastructure in cities. I will in a moment explain why we're focusing on cities, but our focus is on cities, is on local governments, and how local governments are the key focus for an equitable implementation of this vehicle transition. So we're working on a number of different fronts. We're providing policy support and research to local governments throughout the state and soon throughout the country. We are working on a mapping framework and site selection framework, which our incredible students are going to present a little bit later. We've just concluded developing a series of financing and revenue strategies to help meet the gap in investment in underserved communities in this infrastructure. And we're sort of trying to serve as a resource hub, really trying to be, as a university, an entity that gathers all the best research, all the best information on this nexus, which is transportation decarbonization and that transition over the next decade plus, at least here in California, and equity and meeting the mobility needs of underserved communities. And where those two major focus areas intersect is incredibly complex, an area that we're trying to address our slice of it. And we found that actually there are not that many really readily accessible resources that bring these two together to make the point about how transportation decarbonization can advance equity in mobility and redress a lot of the past harms that have been caused by our transportation investments. So we're not doing all that research, but we're trying to be a home for it and bring it together for other advocates. So briefly, and excuse my misplaced brackets here, they migrated north a little bit. Why are we focusing on local governments? Relatively complex, I'll try to make a quick answer. First, this is a first of its kind that we're aware of state-driven technology transition in a major sector. The state of California has set a goal. The federal government is following in its footsteps, and 12 plus other states are implementing the same goal to transition our vehicles from gasoline-powered to fully electrified by 2035. That is a state-driven transition in a huge expense that is one of the most major expenses and major devices in our lives. And we've never done that as a society before at this scale and on this time frame. With that comes a risk of reducing mobility, increasing costs, reducing access to vehicles and to the fuel source that powers them. We can address that risk, but we need to be proactive about it given the timeline that this transition is happening on. Now, the state government in California and the other states that have adopted this policy and the federal government are taking the lead in certain areas, setting the targets themselves, establishing and mandating the technologies that can drive us to fully electrified zero emissions transportation, and the financial incentives to actually get the technology and get charging infrastructure available to people. That's addressing sort of the affordability and availability of vehicles and the affordability of just chargers in the ground for people to actually power the vehicles. That leaves a huge area of policies that from our perspective, I won't say I'm an expert, Ken's an expert in climate policy and in local government action here in California, is really primarily a local leadership space. Planning, permitting, procurement of infrastructure, engagement with communities that actually are going to be the hosts of investment and need new transportation modes, local economic development that can go with transportation investment, and linkages to the question that one of the students raised in the session this morning, linkages to public transit and other modes that are far preferable to private vehicles, right? The electric vehicle cannot just be a one-for-one transition over time. Everyone moves from driving themselves in their private car to driving themselves in their private electric vehicle. We need to promote other modes, and we need to develop infrastructure that facilitates that promotion. For us, that's a local issue, and in particular, ensuring that priority communities, underserved communities, lower income populations, communities of color, have access to better infrastructure than they do today as a result of decarbonization. That's a local matter. That's something that cities need to be involved in, and cities need a lot of resources and assistance to make sure they make that transition happen effectively. So there's a lot on this slide. I'm just going to talk through a couple of quick equity considerations in the vehicle transition. Again, under the auspices of a 2035 transition date in the state of California, a policy that's been established by the governor and by our Air Resources Board to transition the vehicle fleet for all new sales of automobiles to be electrified by 2035, or starting in 2035, there's a lot of equity considerations that go into this. Primarily, access to vehicles and making sure they are available and affordable, and used vehicles are affordable. But our focus here today, access to charging. Charging a vehicle, very different from fueling it up at a gas station. We need to replace all those gas stations with chargers. There's potential to be much more convenient and much more affordable, but it needs to be done appropriately, and there are certain segments of society, lower income residents, residents of multi-unit housing, renters, who do not have easy access to install their own chargers and gain this sort of cost and convenience benefit. So, public charging infrastructure, addressing the cost of private and location of private charging infrastructure, and making sure that charging is affordable and reliable for everyone is a huge equity priority in this transition to make sure that we do not reduce mobility over time. And then, of course, the benefit, the overall benefit of transitioning to zero emissions transportation is addressing air quality, addressing climate change. Air quality impacts from transportation are worst in lower income and underserved communities. Those communities, therefore, stand the most to gain from this transition. We need to make sure that those gains are secured in quality of life and in health. So these are the considerations, this state-led transition, this need for infrastructure, and the equity risks that are raised by it that inform our initiative. And just to put a point on that, this is how we, at least I, view the two risks of this transition. If done improperly, if not adequately planned at the local level, there is a risk that as we electrify our vehicles and as we push gasoline-powered vehicles off the market, we will reduce mobility for residents who cannot afford the vehicles or the infrastructure to charge those vehicles in a way that meets their travel needs. This needs to be planned and thought out. There's also a chance that we reduce affordability if the electricity that powers the vehicles is more expensive, or if those vehicles are more expensive. We've already seen this with the way some of the auto manufacturers are trying to address the transition, which is as a new chance to push out a ton of new technology and really cool, really powerful, huge vehicles. We need to make sure that decarbonization of transportation is not just an opportunity to raise costs. So our focus is to try to make sure that these risks do not happen in this transition. I'm going to quickly run through just a couple of data points, not our own, data points from others, just to sort of put a point on the risk of this transition. This is probably not very visible for all of you, but you can see some trends pointing down in the first graph and pointing up in the second graph. On the left, we have access to California vehicle rebates for populations that are ranked highly in CalEnviroscreen, which is an indicator of environmental risk. Hispanic populations, those with a less than high school education, and those with higher poverty percentile. And what we see is as you go up in each of those indicators, access to the rebates in California for these vehicles diminishes. As in, the populations that need them most, those who are most environmentally vulnerable, those with least education, and those with lowest income have had the least access to the rebates that reduce the cost of electric vehicles to date. Obviously not the policy outcome we're looking for. The second is the air quality benefits that are associated with the transition to electric vehicles and the reduction of internal combustion engines on the road. Those same four population groups experience less benefit in air quality as you increase the sensitivity of the population, showing that the populations that benefit most from the transition are the richest, are the whitest, are the best educated, and the least environmentally vulnerable. So we need equity-focused policies to advance this goal. Switching from vehicles to charging access, these two charts show the average access to public electric vehicle charging as you increase the proportion of multifamily residents across different population segments. And what we see is that, in general, the more multifamily residents, the more public charging, good thing. But the populations that benefit the most on the left, in purple and blue, are the two highest income segments. And on the right are the white and Asian segments, whereas the black and Hispanic populations have had the least access. So black and brown communities and lower income communities have the least access to public charging in California so far. By contrast, a survey from last year from a group of advocates and Consumer Reports showed that interest amongst those communities is highest. So black and brown Americans are more interested in electrifying their vehicles, broadly speaking, than white Americans, and yet they are more likely to live in multifamily housing and they're more likely to rent their homes, meaning they have the least ability to actually go and install their own chargers and control that situation as this market has sort of defined it. So we have this really difficult equity problem that needs to be addressed by proactive policy. How are we doing this in our work? One thing I'll focus on before panning over to my colleagues who have developed our incredible mapping tool is an action plan framework that we're developing. So this is a guidebook for local governments. A few governments in California and a few around the country have started to develop really targeted plans on how to do this zero-emission vehicle transition over the coming decade. Very, very few have actually done it. We want to develop a guidebook for all local governments to have access to every good local policy and every kind of pilot program that we can find that is effective in this space, for them to select the ones that fit their communities and cultivate and craft a local plan and then go implement it. So this is meant to be kind of a master guidebook with everything under the sun in it. We're working with a group of local California-based and national advocates to get perspective not just from California, but from states like Colorado, Virginia, Illinois, North Carolina, and Michigan, to get other local programs built into this so it's not just a California document. And over the course of this year, we're gathering feedback from experts throughout this space to build what we think at the end of the year will be a really comprehensive guidebook, including a host of strategy areas, everything from public charging to city fleets to funding and implementation to community engagement, to build a plan that actually advances mobility the way that communities need this investment. So that's the policy space that we're working on. I will actually just skip over legislation since I want to get to the map. The other space that we're working on here that we want to focus on today and show you guys is mapping. So, incredibly important, charging infrastructure is expensive, it's time-consuming, and very complex to install. We need to treat it like public transportation infrastructure. It needs to go where it's needed, and it shouldn't go where it's not needed. We don't want to have chargers that don't get used. It's a waste of money. It will get vandalized. It will get left alone, and it's not worth our time. So we need to make sure that the public is investing in infrastructure that's going to actually be used. In order to do that, we need to have the right criteria visually depicted to make informed decisions so that local governments can be intelligent about it and so that they can work with communities to show them where investments are planned and to identify where communities prioritize which kinds of investment. So the tool that we're developing is designed for local governments and stakeholders to make group decisions around EV charger and zero emissions mobility infrastructure siting with a focus on equity. 4 key components for us, and then we're going to have our students talk through how they developed it. 1, needs to be data rich. We'll talk about the approach for that in a second, but it needs to combine all the relevant data sources to incorporate equity into transportation site selection. It needs to be flexible and tailored to the local context. It's not just a one-size-fits-all tool that shows a map. It needs to be tailorable. It needs to be modifiable. And so what we've developed is something that actually allows the user to select which criteria are included and at what intensities. It needs to be user-friendly so that very advanced local government staff can use it, semi-advanced local government staff can use it, and communities can use it to make their own identifications of priority areas. And then finally, free and publicly accessible. Usually this is the kind of thing that local government would need to hire a consultant for, get a one-off product, produce a report, get a result. If it's going to be used and it's going to be iterative and it's going to be shared with communities, it needs to be free, it needs to be accessible all the time so that decisions can be made, checked, reviewed, modified, et cetera. So we're working on making it a publicly accessible tool. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ankita to introduce the background and history of this tool, and then Ari is going to talk through some of the building blocks and layers that go into it.
So Ted went over what the problem was and what we're trying to create. So initially, what we did was we looked into research which showed the disparity between equity and where actually chargers are located and who benefits from it. We spoke with Oakland city officials, San Francisco city officials to understand what data was important to them to make these decisions, and that was our first discovery stage. Based on that, we decided on a mapping tool. Initially, we created a tool which had all these data sources. It was just a map with all the filters on it. The user would look at all these data and decide what to do with it. But then we realized that that is a lot of information to process. So we went back to the city officials and we went through the data that we had on our system, and we trimmed a little, we change the way it is represented. And at the same time, instead of showing all the data, we actually have a system where, based on the city's needs, they can pick what is important to them, and then we'll narrow down and show the area that qualifies. And once we knew what we wanted, we worked on it in the delivery phase, created this map. We have something called a pixel approach, which Ari will talk more about, and we have our current map.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about the architectural approach that we took to actually creating this map, and then we'll get to see an example of the map in action. So first of all, we started by defining 3 different types of layers for the mapping tool. The first is a priority layer, and this is for local governments to think about where might they want to site EV charging infrastructure in terms of who they want to be serving and what areas they want to serve. So this layer, this priority layer, includes things like the Cal EnviroScreen metric that Ted mentioned and other environmental justice metrics, as well as where kind of priority residents might live. So that includes multi-unit dwellers, renters, as well as kind of people who don't currently have access to charging infrastructure. So where are the charging deserts? The next type of layer is a feasibility layer, and this essentially asks the question, where is it possible to build new charging infrastructure? The 2 components we have of that feasibility layer at this point are funding availability through different state or federal funding streams and grants, as well as kind of electricity grid-related constraints, so things like substation proximity and, in cases where we have the data, load capacity information from utilities themselves. The last kind of layer is co-location points. So this is when cities are thinking, once you have a general idea of where you want to site your infrastructure, where are the public schools or libraries or grocery stores, areas that might serve as good kind of co-location points in order to enhance economic development opportunities and create kind of hubs, whether that's mobility or large low-income housing units, so that you can serve some of those multiple needs at once. So Ankita mentioned our kind of pixel grid approach, and that is really the backbone for our priority and feasibility layers. I'm going to talk through the 3 advantages that are provided by our pixel grid approach. This is essentially breaking down the map into 100-meter squares that represent kind of small chunks of population and are our basis for filtering on these different dimensions. So the first advantage of the pixel grid approach is that it's easy to interpret. You can see I've included a kind of early iteration of our map here, and when you're just throwing data layers together, it can be very challenging to see, what am I supposed to take away from this? Once you've kind of flattened everything into a pixel grid, you can clearly filter out which pixels you want to see, which we'll demonstrate in just a minute. And it's very clear, the blue areas that remain here are the kind of high priority zones. Second advantage is this kind of scale issue. Our pixels, 100 meters squared, balance precision with kind of computational tractability and speed of analysis. So you don't want your tool to be super slow. If you were using tax parcels over on the right-hand side, you might run into some kind of data size issues there. In addition, tax parcels are expensive to come by and are compiled at the county level, so a bit of a data nightmare. On the other hand, if you were using census tracts or census blocks, which is shown on the left side here for Cal EnviroScreen, it can be hard to kind of pinpoint locations that might be good candidates for charging infrastructure. So our kind of Goldilocks approach right here in the middle, and these are the same 3 maps of Oakland here, shows our 100-meter grid, which seems to be kind of a just right size. The final advantage here is that the pixels allow us to integrate data across a diversity of data types and data geometries. So I've kind of given a little primer here of the 3 types of geospatial data geometry. You have point data, line data, and polygon data. And the advantage of the pixels is we can kind of throw everything into the pixels. So one condition can be, does it contain a point? Another condition can be, does a line run through the pixel, or is a pixel part of a polygon, and if so, kind of what's the value associated with it. So you can represent all of these diverse data types, geometries, granularities within your single pixel grid. So getting to the example, we're going to show you the city of Oakland and our process of kind of narrowing down what might be good candidate EV charger sites in the city of Oakland. So we start out with these priority pixels, which we're showing in blue, and these are kind of sneak peek screenshots of our mapping tool itself. And the first step you can take is expand out your priority selectors and select for a number of criteria. So in the example here, we're saying we want the composite indicator of the CalEnviro score, which is again the environmental justice metric, to be at the 70th percentile or higher. We also want to make sure that we're putting charging infrastructure in places where people might face high barriers to home charging. So we kind of said we want a certain density of multifamily residents, 25 per pixel, and a certain density of renters, 60 per pixel. And then the last is that we wanted to put these priority zones in kind of level 2 charging deserts. So these are defined in this example here as areas where you cannot walk to a level 2 charger in 10 minutes. The rationale there is level 2 charging takes many, many hours, so it would be nice to be able to kind of walk home or walk to a commercial area, let's say, while your car is charging. The next step is filtering out for that feasibility criterion. And here we have 2 different criteria that we're using for feasibility. The first, we've filtered out for eligibility for the IRS 30C property credit, which is a property credit that applies to both low-income and non-urban census tracts. You can see examples of both of these within the city of Oakland. And then we also wanted about 100 kilowatts of PG&E load capacity to run through the pixel. So again, that's data we got from PG&E on the location and load capacity of every power line. And here we're showing pixels that have kind of sufficient load capacity to build about 10 level 2 chargers. And you can see kind of a number of hotspots where priority and feasibility overlap. The most evident is Fruitvale, kind of right in the center of the map. So your next step using this tool could be zooming in on that area and checking some of the boxes for those co-location points. And suddenly you can see the priority and feasibility pixels situated within the context of low-income housing tax credit eligible properties and city or county parks, transit stations, things like that. I'll now turn it over to, before I do, I have an example, the same example for the city of San Francisco. So you can see I'm kind of skipped some of the steps here, but similar, filtering out based on the environmental justice metric. This time we're using drivability to DC fast chargers. So this is maybe a different priority where you're wanting to install a DC fast charging infrastructure. And then again, the multifamily and renter conditions there. And in this case, because you're dealing with kind of drivability to DC fast chargers, I believe there's a condition in there as well about DC fast driving or charging deserts, and you also have a different condition there for the load capacity. So we've bumped that way up to 1.5 megawatts of load capacity, which would correspond to a higher level of DC fast chargers. Additionally, because we're talking about DC fast, we wanted proximity to alternative fuel corridors, major freeways, and so we used National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, funding eligibility instead of IRS 30C. So you can see kind of the flexibility here of approach. And again, if you're the city of San Francisco looking at this map, you can kind of start to pick off priority charging locations. I'll note here, Treasure Island is not served by PG&E, so you can see an example of where local knowledge might come into play, right? That's a high priority area that doesn't show up as feasible, but if you're a San Francisco official, you know to chat with the Treasure Island Development Authority and figure out what could work there. I'll also just note that this kind of little experiment here with our map and the city of San Francisco confirmed some other research that CLE had done on public parking lots in San Francisco that could be good candidates for EV charging infrastructure. And you can see really good matching up between the left, which is our tool, and the right, which is that previous analysis. All right, now I'm excited to turn it over to Ankita, and she'll walk you through a live demo of the tool.
Okay. So right now we are looking at Oakland map. We have access to SF map as well. The blue one is priority pixels. Feasibility pixels is right under it. You get to choose the color that you want to see. Under priority pixel, I'll recreate what Ari showed just now. If we want Cal Enviro screen score above 70, we just have to So as you move, you can see it filtering down. We wanted it to be somewhere around 70%. So it keeps filtering down. The second one was multifamily, more than 25 residents per pixel. It filtered down further, and renters, I think, more than 60 per pixel. Oops. I'll leave it at 53. Now changing places which do not have, which are not walkable, so we'll bring this all the way down. Just to show how it looks as you filter it down, it keeps reducing.
Keith, I'll just point out while you're through the process here. Of course, what we're seeing is priority communities emerging, and these are areas that anybody who's involved in the city of Oakland will know as priority areas. But the advantage of the approach that Ankita is demonstrating is sort of pixel by pixel, step by step, identifying where those communities are. So it's not just a static depiction of communities pre-identified. It's actually showing how they emerge through these criteria.
Thank you. Now let's look at feasibility. We can move this slide slowly. You can see it filtering down as you move it. If we want capacity over 100, we got it filtered down further, and IRC 30C. So similar to what you saw on the last slide, Fruitvale is somewhere you see both priority and feasibility. And let's zoom in to see which location would be good. So you can go down and pick co-location points. BART, you see BART appearing here. City parks, health facilities, low-income housing properties, public libraries, and public schools. So if a location over here is both has priority and has feasibility, these points will help you make decisions if you want to provide parking in this location, or how these different co-location points would influence your decision on where the charging would go. You could utilize the parking available in these spaces, or try to put it in between them so that you have access to both of them.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to walk through a few more kind of interesting ins and outs of what's possible with this tool and demonstrate some of its features to you in the process. So one thing that I think is clear, first of all, we have this awesome reset sliders button, which is fantastic. And I think this was probably already clear during the demo, but when we say we have these kind of multiple geometries that are integrated within the tool, it means you can kind of see that some of the geometries are pretty clearly linear data, some are polygon data, I'll just uncheck all these, and some are point data. So you can see, for instance, the population indicator is kind of point data in the sense that each pixel is assigned a population value. And as you slide this slider up, you see that you're filtering out points at a time. On the other hand, Cal Enviro screen is polygon data. I showed you that on the slide way back. That's by census tract. And you can see as you filter here, you're not filtering kind of at the grid level of granularity, but you are filtering out census tracts at a time. So the pixel grid allows us to integrate these different types of data, but the user would, has to be kind of conscious that you are dealing with different granularities, and in this case, you'd be filtering out, larger polygons at a time. And then the last example here, going to the feasibility data, is this linear data. Each PG&E power line is represented as a line with some value, so we're saying kind of show us which pixels have a line running through them at a certain value. On that note of PG&E, one of our kind of guiding principles here is flexibility to local needs, and this felt really important in this context in particular because PG&E just gives you the kind of load capacity available, but the load capacity required for different EV charging projects is going to look super different. So if you just want to build 10 level 2 chargers, you're way down here at the kind of 60 to 100 kilowatt level, and you can see most of the city of Oakland would be kind of a reasonable candidate location. Absolutely, you have some kind of load deserts in here, but by and large, you have options. On the other hand, if you're building 10 DC fast chargers at 150 kilowatts each, then you're talking about kind of 1,500 kilowatts, which pretty seriously reduces the options you have to play with. And at this point, you're considering kind of writing to PG&E about applying for a line extension, or even better, applying for a permit in a place that has load capacity. And you can imagine in the age of kind of megawatt charging, which a few companies are talking about, you'd really have to slide this slider way up, and you can see you get even more restricted at that point. The last thing I'll mention is we've implemented these kind of walkability and drivability, it's called isochrones, or same time, to existing charging infrastructure. And this is really nice for identifying kind of current charging deserts, which can be used as a criterion for citing future charging infrastructure, but also for kind of assessing the current state of play. So we already showed kind of level 2 charging deserts. You can see that most of the city of Oakland does not currently have access within a 10-minute walk to level 2 charging infrastructure. And this is by kind of number of charging ports that you have access to. That drops off even more quickly as you slide up to even having 1 charging port available or 2 charging ports available. You do get a pretty quick drop off. If I can slide this, oopsies. And at these higher levels, it is really just that kind of downtown area that has charging access. On the other hand, because we have defined DC fast charging access by drivability, and Oakland is not a huge city, if you dialed this down to 0, you would see that it's really only the hills and this one kind of area of East Oakland that is in a DC fast charging desert. But in that case, you're thinking a little bit more about competition between drivers, having to wait in line to charge your vehicle just for a half hour. And so you can see as you dial this up a little bit, you get a much more nuanced picture of where charging access is dense and where it's not. And I'll just add a note. It's very kind of fun to see the freeway corridors as EV charging access hotspots, because if you're live near a freeway, then you can hop on and drive to a charger. But it also speaks to another strength of this tool, which is that it doesn't treat these cities as a vacuum. So these drive times include chargers outside the city of Oakland. You recognize that there are no physical borders between these local municipalities. And so if you live in the south of Oakland, you of course have access to San Leandro chargers. It's just a question of where the city of Oakland wants to prioritize its charger construction. I think that's all we have for you. We'd like to take any questions that you have. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. And so with that, I just do want to thank you for just an amazing talk. If you guys had any kind of closing remarks before we end, otherwise.
I would just say thank you for joining us. Thanks for your interest in this topic. And I think the slides will be shared afterward, right? We have our contact info in there. We want feedback on our work. We want feedback on our ideas, and so we encourage people to reach out. But I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, that was going to be my thing. We emails in there, and please do reach out to us with questions or feedback. I think the whole idea of this tool and the development of the tool is that it is an engaged process. So if there's something you like, something you don't like, let us know.
And that's a perfect segue into saying that this has actually been recorded, and so it will be available on our UCCS website at uccs.ucdavis.edu, as well as the slide deck and all of your contact information too. And if there are any questions that didn't get answered on Zoom, we can also look at putting the responses to that on our website as well. So thank you so much for a fantastic talk today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.